So Mark Carney just confronted Donald Trump to his face, not through a press conference afterward, not through a prepared statement delivered from a separate room, not through diplomatic channels or parliamentary speeches or retaliatory policies issued from 3,000 meters away face-to-face in the same room on camera at the G7 Leaders Summit in Hiroshima, with every major Democratic leader on earth watching from around the table and 400 million people watching live from their homes. And what Carney said, calmly, methodically, without raising his voice a single time, without a note of anger or theatrics or performance, left the room in absolute silence in the White House without an official response for 14 hours. The image is already iconic. It is on the front page of every major newspaper in the world this morning. Carney seated, leaning slightly forward, speaking directly at Trump across the summit table, a bound document open in front of him. Trump seated opposite, motionless, his mouth slightly open, visibly processing something he did not expect and has no framework for answering. The composed Canadian Prime Minister and the silent American president, two leaders, one room, one table. And every person in that room and every person watching that feed understanding in the same moment that something fundamental had just shifted, not in the trade war, in the perception of who actually holds power and who merely performs it. Warren Buffett said it was the most instructive display of negotiating dynamics he's witnessed in decades. In 70 years of boardrooms, Buffett said, I have learned one absolute truth about confrontations. The person who is prepared always defeats the person who is confident. Always. Confidence without preparation is performance. Preparation without confidence is unnecessary because the facts provide their own confidence. And that confidence, the earned kind, the kind that comes from knowing the numbers cold, is the only kind that survives contact with reality. But the single line that will define this moment, the line that cut through the diplomacy and the posturing and the noise and landed in the silence of a room full of the most powerful people on earth, is what Carney said directly to Trump when Trump attempted to interrupt his presentation. 12 words delivered without heat, without hesitation, and without the slightest doubt about which side of the table was prepared and which was performing. I have the numbers, you have the talking points, the room knows. When you understand how this meeting was supposed to go, what Trump expected to happen, what Carney actually did with the 90 minutes he was given, why the White House couldn't respond for 14 hours, and what Buffett said about the principle underneath all of it, you'll understand why this isn't just a diplomatic confrontation. It's the moment the world saw in real time the difference between power and preparation, and it learned which one wins. Hit subscribe because what happened in that room is going to be studied in diplomatic history, negotiation theory, and political science for the next 50 years. Let me take you through how this happened, because the setting matters, the context matters, and what was supposed to happen in that room matters, because it is the opposite of what actually happened. The G7 summit in Hiroshima was originally scheduled months in advance as a routine leaders meeting focused on global economic coordination and security. But by the time the summit convened, the U.S.-Canada crisis had consumed every other agenda item. European leaders, Asian partners, and the host nation had spent weeks pressing publicly and privately for direct engagement between Trump and Carney. The theory was institutional optimism. If they could get the two leaders in the same room surrounded by allied heads of state who could moderate the dynamic, perhaps the confrontation could be de-escalated before it caused permanent damage to the Western alliance structure. Weeks of back-channel negotiations between Washington and Ottawa preceded the summit. The White House insisted on a structured bilateral format, a controlled meeting with agreed-upon talking points, a limited time frame, and cameras present only for brief opening remarks before the room was cleared for private discussion. The Canadian side agreed to the format. They agreed to the time frame. They did not, as would become clear, agree to the script. The White House had prepared Trump with standard summit talking points, the kind of language designed to project strength while committing to nothing. The strong relationship between our two nations. Nobody respects Canada more than I do. We want to see fair terms, and I think we're going to get there. Boilerplate. The communication strategy was clear. Project engagement, signal magnanimity, avoid specifics, and leave the room having created the appearance of dialogue without the substance of concession. The media expected diplomatic theater, a handshake, a photo, parallel press conferences afterward where each side would claim progress. That is what G7 bilaterals produce. That is what the format is designed to produce. Carney came with something different, not talking points, not diplomatic language calibrated by communication staff. A dossier, a bound document later reported to be 147 pages containing a comprehensive data-dense, forensically sourced accounting of every dimension of the trade war. Economic cost to the United States category by category. Economic cost to Canada, cost to the global economy, strategic positioning lost, alliances damaged, human toll on both sides of the border, organized not as a negotiating position but as an evidentiary presentation, the kind of document a central bank governor presents to a board of directors when the institution is in crisis. He had spent 2 weeks preparing it personally, working with a team of economists, trade analysts, and and diplomatic strategists who understood that this was not a meeting, it was an opportunity, and opportunities of this magnitude do not come twice. The room was arranged in the standard G7 bilateral format, a rectangular table, Trump and Carney seated opposite each other at the center, their respective delegations flanking them, flags behind each leader, pool cameras positioned at the far end of the room for the opening remarks. The other G7 leaders, France, Germany, the UK, Italy, Japan, the EU president, were not at the bilateral table, but were monitoring the feed from an adjacent conference room where the live camera output was displayed on screens. The press corps, over 300 journalists from every major international outlet, watched the same feed from the media center one floor below. The room was warm, the lighting was bright and flat, designed for cameras. Staff members from both delegations lined the walls behind their respective leaders. The atmosphere was tense in the way that all high-stakes diplomatic encounters are tense. The controlled formality of people who understand that small gestures carry enormous weight. Carney was already seated when Trump entered. He had placed the dossier on the table in front of him, centered, visible, the cover page facing up. He had opened it to the first page, and he waited. Trump spoke first, and in the first 90 seconds, it was exactly what the White House had prepared. He delivered his opening with the practiced ease of a man who has given 10,000 speeches and understands instinctively how to fill a room. Broad, warm, confident. It's great to be here with Prime Minister Carney. Great. A lot of people said this wouldn't happen, and here we are. We have a tremendous relationship with Canada, a tremendous country, and I think we're going to work things out. I really do. We want fairness. That's all we've ever wanted. Fair terms for the American worker, fair terms for the Canadian worker, and I think Mark and I can find that. He gestured expansively as he spoke, addressing the cameras as much as Carney, performing the role of the gracious leader magnanimously, offering the smaller nation a seat at his table. His body language was relaxed, expansive, the posture of someone who believes he controls the room simply by being in it. The staff along the walls nodded, the format was holding, the script was working. And then the White House press coordinator signaled the pool camera operators to prepare for exit. The opening remarks were concluding, and the cameras were supposed to leave. And then Carney responded, and within 15 seconds, every person in the room understood that the cameras would not be leaving. He did not match Trump's warmth. He did not smile. He did not offer reciprocal pleasantries or acknowledge the tremendous relationship or play the diplomatic game of pretending that the previous 2 years had not happened. He looked directly at Trump, not at the cameras, not at the delegations along the walls, not at some middle distance designed to project statesmanship at Trump. And he spoke in a register the room had never heard from him in a diplomatic setting, quiet, measured, completely devoid of performance. Mr. President, I appreciate the opportunity to speak directly, and I intend to use it not for pleasantries, for facts, because the facts are what this conversation has needed for 2 years, and the facts are what I've brought. He placed his hand on the dossier. The room shifted. Staff members along the walls exchanged glances. The press coordinator froze mid-signal. The camera operator stayed, and then Carney began. He spoke for 22 minutes without interruption, 22 minutes of data presented with the clinical precision of someone who has spent a career presenting to central bank boards and finance ministry committees, the kind of rooms where performance is worthless and numbers are everything. He started with the economic cost to the United States, not rhetoric, numbers. The tariff war's net cost to American GDP, a cumulative reduction of 1.7% over 22 months, representing approximately $460 billion in lost economic output. The energy suspension's cost to American border states $14.3 billion in emergency energy procurement, grid stabilization, and economic disruption in the first 90 days alone. The defense deal's cost to American contractors $480 billion euros and lost European procurement over 15 years with $97 billion in immediate market capitalization losses across the defense sector. The Halifax corridor's projected cost to American East Coast ports $38 to $4 billion in annual shipping revenue diversion. The agricultural diversification's cost to American food processors and consumers $12 billion in the first 6 months. The potash tariffs cost to American farmers a 43% increase in fertilizer costs during planting season, projected yield reductions of 15 to 25%, and a $3.6 billion windfall to the Canadian industry it was supposed to punish. Each number cited, each source identified, each page of the dossier turned with the deliberateness of a man who knows that the document is doing the work and the silence between the numbers is doing the rest. Then the cost to Canada, he did not hide it. Canadian GDP impact negative, measurable, painful, job losses across affected sectors, real, documented, acknowledged, communities disrupted, industries restructured, families who bore the cost of a confrontation they did not choose. He stated Canada's losses with the same precision he'd stated America's because the honesty made the comparison irrefutable. Canada had paid a price. The question was whether the price had been worth it. And then he presented the answer. Canada's trade diversification across 23 new markets, the Arctic Sovereignty Accord signed by 23 nations, the European Defense defense partnership, the Halifax trade corridor, the agricultural export portfolio now generating higher revenue at better margins than the American market had ever provided. Each gain listed against the losses, the ledger balanced, the conclusion inescapable. Canada had emerged from the trade war structurally stronger than it entered. The United States had not. Then the cost to the world, global trade contraction, supply chain fragmentation, allied confidence in American partnership at its lowest measured level since the end of World War II, international institutions undermined, multilateral frameworks built specifically to root around American unilateral action. IMF projections and World Bank assessments cited verbatim page numbers referenced the data trail visible to anyone who wanted to verify. And then Trump interrupted. He leaned forward, waved a hand, the instinctive gesture of a man who dominates rooms by filling them with his voice, and said, "Those numbers are look, we've heard a lot of numbers, and frankly, our numbers are very different. And I think if you look at what we've done," Carney stopped speaking. He did not talk over Trump. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward or gesture or show any visible reaction. He set his pen down on the dossier, and he waited with the patience of a man who has all the time in the world, with the stillness of someone who understands that silence in a room full of powerful people is the most uncomfortable sound there is. Trump's sentence did not finish. It trailed off the momentum of his interjection, dissipating into the silence that Carney had created, and that Trump could not fill with anything substantive because he did not have the data to fill it with. He had talking points, and talking points are not designed for this. They are designed for press conferences and rallies and friendly interviews, environments where the speaker controls the floor. They are not designed for a room where the other person has 147 pages of sourced analysis and the composure to wait through any interruption until the silence becomes the argument. The silence held for 4 seconds. In diplomatic time, 4 seconds is an eternity. And then Carney responded, "Mr. President, I have the numbers. You have the talking points. The room knows." The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of people choosing not to speak, the silence of people unable to. The line was not aggressive, not personal, not theatrical. It was a factual observation about the difference between two kinds of preparation. And it landed with the force of a conclusion because everyone in that room, including Trump, including his own delegation, understood that it was true. The numbers were in the dossier, the talking points were in the interruption, and the room did know. Carney continued. Trump did not attempt to interject again the strategic consequences. What the trade war had cost the United States and allied trust in Arctic access permanently foreclosed in a European defense architecture rebuilt without American participation, in agricultural markets redirected to competitors who would not give them back, in a global perception now confirmed in real time on camera at a G7 summit that American power had become untethered from American competence. Each point delivered not as an accusation but as an audit finding. The tone of a man presenting a balance sheet to shareholders, not a man arguing with an adversary. The distinction was everything. Arguments can be countered. Audits can only be accepted or denied. And denial in the face of 147 pages is not a strategy. It is a confession. Then the human toll. American farmers who couldn't afford fertilizer, Canadian workers who lost jobs in the first months of the confrontation, port communities on both sides of the border watching their livelihoods restructure around them, families, American and Canadian, who had done nothing except live in countries whose leaders could not find a way to stop. Carney's voice shifted here, slightly warmer, slightly slower. The cadence of someone who understood that behind every data point was a person. He named no individuals. He didn't need to. The categories were enough. Farmers, workers, families. The universality was the point. Then the path forward, specific, measurable technical tariff rollback schedules with timelines, diplomatic restoration protocols, trade normalization frameworks, energy cooperation terms. Each one presented not as a demand, but as a technical requirement. The way an engineer presents the specifications for a bridge. Not what I want, but what the structure requires to hold. Carney closed the dossier. The sound of the cover closing, a soft, firm thud, was audible on the broadcast feed. He looked at Trump one final time. "Mr. President, I did not come here to negotiate. Negotiation requires both sides to bring something to the table. I came to present the facts because the facts have not been part of this conversation for 2 years. They are now. Every number in this document is sourced, cited, and verifiable. What you do with them is your decision. But the facts themselves are no longer in dispute. They never were. They were just never spoken aloud in a room where you were present. Now they have been." He sat back. The room held. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 7. The silence stretched into a space that nobody wanted to be the first to break. The summit moderator, Japan's Prime Minister, shifted in his chair in the adjacent room but did not speak. The camera operators held their positions. Along the wall behind Trump, a senior White House aide was already typing on a phone with both thumbs. The first attempt at a response that would take 14 hours to arrive and would satisfy no one when it did. And then the room exhaled. The other G7 leaders in the adjacent monitoring room reacted in ways that were observed and reported within minutes by the diplomatic press. France's president turned to Germany's chancellor and said in a comment overheard by 2 journalists analyst position near the door. That is the most extraordinary thing I have witnessed in 15 years of summits. The UK's Prime Minister was described as sitting in absolute stillness for several seconds before saying quietly to an aide he just changed the room. Japan's Prime Minister, the summit host, reportedly said nothing at all but was seen nodding slowly once in a gesture that carried the weight of every word he chose not to say. Trump's response, or rather his non-response, became the second most covered element of the encounter after the confrontation itself. He did not rebut. He did not counter with alternative data. He did not produce a document of his own. He offered a brief, subdued closing. Well, we'll see. We have a lot of very good people looking at all of this, and we'll see what happens. Delivered in a tone markedly different from his expansive, confident opening. Flatter, quieter. The casual dominance that had filled the room 90 minutes earlier had been replaced by something else. Not defeat exactly, something worse for a man who has built an entire career on the projection of dominance, irrelevance, the sense that the room had moved on, that the conversation was now between Carney's dossier and the world, and that Trump was no longer a participant in it, merely a subject. The White House issued no official statement for 14 hours in an administration that typically responds to every development within minutes, often within seconds via social media. The silence was itself the most analyzed response of the day. When the statement finally came, it read, President Trump had a productive meeting with Prime Minister Carney and looks forward to continued discussions on trade and economic issues. 17 words of boilerplate that addressed nothing Carney had said, referenced none of the data presented, and acknowledged no element of what the entire world had just watched.